Du Bois is full of writings on Latin America in between World War I and World War II. He argues, as we see in the handout, he argues for an attitude of deepest sympathy and strongest alliance for the peoples affected by 1898, the Spanish-American War. And Marti, of course, is famous for his critiques of U.S. imperialism, and in particular, he argued that the United States was all too ready to set aside the rights of other countries in the name of liberty, and that continues today. So if you can turn to the flip side of the handout, this is a rough accounting of some of the materials in the individual chapters. The first image is of Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton, who's the author of The Squatter and the Dawn, and she's the first Latina woman to publish a novel in English in the United States. So I examined the unfolding narratives of decolonization in 4 chapters that all fall within one or more of the waves of decolonization that I discussed that are shaped by those 4 wars. In chapter 1, I focus on a novel by Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton, as I mentioned. She was born in Baja California, but her mother elected to become a U.S. citizen and moved to Alta California in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. And this was under the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which offered U.S. citizenship to Mexicans in the North. Helen Hunt Jackson was a white New Englander who was shocked by U.S. mistreatment of Indians and dedicated herself to the cause of Indian reform. So both of these novels, Helen Hunt Jackson's Ramona and Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton's The Squatter and the Dawn, use discourses of sentimental melodrama and representing struggles for social position and the racialized social hierarchy of 1870s California following the Mexican-American War. Sentimentalism is best known to readers of American literature through the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Although Stowe's novel deserves a lot of credit for its deft use of sentimental discourse in a way that made it a runaway bestseller, critics have rightly faulted it for its patronizing stance toward blacks. This chapter questions the extent to which sentimentalism is adequate to the task of promoting decolonization. Ramona and The Squatter and the Dawn both utilize this discourse of sentimentalism that Stowe wielded to such great effect in differing ways. Ramona sympathizes with Mexicans and Indians as the victims of U.S. empire and thus constructs a discourse of hemispheric citizenship. By contrast, The Squatter and the Dawn rejects the struggles of African Americans and Indians for rights and staking claim for the Californios and naturalized Mexicans to be considered a part of the white South and thus faithful U.S. imperial citizens. Chapter 2 focuses primarily on the writings of José Marti, the Cuban poet, essayist, journalist, and independence leader, and Du Bois. It also focuses on the figure of Teresa Urrea, a young mestiza woman whom the Indians of northern Mexico believed to be a saint in the 1890s. Celebrated as the Santa de Cabora, Urrea attracted crowds of up to 15,000 people to her healings and became the figurehead of their rebellions against the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. Diaz prioritized the needs of foreign capital over the needs of Indians in Mexico. Forced into exile in the United States, Urrea joined the so-called paper revolution of Lauro Aguirre, a journalist, and collaborated with him on a borderlands newspaper called El Independiente, or The Independent. And this newspaper kind of tapped in to the rebellious energies of Indians and fiercely criticized the dictatorship of Diaz. Now there are 2 argumentative threads in this mammoth chapter that kind of got loose of my control and ran havoc with me. The first argumentative thread is that Marti, Du Bois, and Urrea all constructed anti-imperialist messianic discourses that were central to their projects of decolonization. What is Messianism? St. Paul, in Letter to the Romans, defines the days of the Messiah as a time when the weak and unimportant will come to prevail over the strong and important. This comes about through the messianic conditions transformation of all juridical conditions. Messianism is central to the political visions of all 3 writers. In his speech, Mother America, or Madre America, which was published in 1889, Marti prophetically envisions the future of Latin America as a messianic redemptive march of various ethnicities and groups that were typical of various nations in Latin America. An international multiracial army uniting Creoles, Mestizos, Gauchos, Indians, and blacks from the Caribbean and Latin America. Similarly, the novel Dark Princess, which was Du Bois's favorite novel that he had written, and one of my favorites as well, tells the story of a long amorous relationship and political collaboration between the Princess Kautilya of Bhojpur, India, and an African-American medical student and later politician and union activist named Matthew Towns. These two attempt to bring together and catalyze Pan-Africanism and the Pan-Asian movement, as well as Marxism and their relations with Marxism. These two give birth to a child named Madhu, whom Du Bois calls the Messiah and messenger to all of the darker worlds. Madhu is a new kind of citizen, an Afro-Asian who embodies resistance to racial oppression and global imperialism. And finally, the Santa de Cabora, whom historians have celebrated as the Mexican Messiah and the Chicana mystic, herself is a sort of messianic text collectively authored by through her own writings, but also by the beliefs of her followers and collaborators, both the illiterate indigenous groups that claimed her, but also the journalist Lauro Aguirre. In one of her contributions to Lauro Aguirre's newspaper, El Independiente of El Paso, Urrea calls for her readers to subordinate their professed belief in the Messiah to the need to follow his example. This messianic text, that is the Santa de Cabora, constitutes an intercultural cross-class alliance against the neocolonialism of Porfirio Diaz. Unlike the messianic visions of Marti and Du Bois, the figure of Santa de Cabora positions the intellectual in a different way, as a tool rather than a catalyst of revolution. So the second argumentative thread of this chapter maintains that Marti and Du Bois expanded the meanings of decolonization through a politics of interracial and transnational alliance that itself defines the politics of hemispheric citizenship. And what I'm interested in doing in this portion of the argument is to trace how the event of 1898, the Spanish-American War, appears in the writings of both writers. In Marti, it appears more proleptically as something he's creating, and in Du Bois, it appears as an event that he relates to Reconstruction in the United States, as well as the problems surrounding World War I and continuing imperialism. In Chapter 3, if you look on your handout, is about three nationalisms that took place in the 1920s, all of which focused on the oppression of subnational groups or minority groups. In this chapter, I begin by looking at two special issues of an influential journal in the 1920s, the Survey Graphic. The first is in May 1924, the Survey Graphics publishes a special issue called Mexico, A Promise. This announces a new Mexico emerging in the wake of the Mexican Revolution. The contributors were kind of a who's who of the Mexican intellectual and political elite: Manuel Gamio, José Vasconcelos, the muralist Diego Rivera, and the Mexican president himself, Plutarco Calles. Carlton Beals and Catherine Ann Porter also contributed. Now, my question is whether Mexico, A Promise served as a model for Alain Locke's Harlem, Mecca of the New Negro, which came out the very next year in the Survey Graphic. And in fact, I did find that there were many interrelations among the Harlem Renaissance, Cuban Negrismo, and Mexican Indigenismo, the most famous of which is the collaboration between Hughes and Langston Hughes, the poet, and Nicolas Guillen, the Afro-Cuban poet. But beyond that famous collaboration, there were multiple shared institutional and discursive spaces among these three movements. They all used primitivist discourses, and not always in the stereotypical way that many would expect. So this chapter maps the cross-fertilizations among these three nationalisms that all defended and celebrated the culture of racially subordinated groups. Now, I focus on two sets of test cases that display the use of primitivist discourses as socio-political critique. First, I show how Hughes and Beals practiced hemispheric citizenship by constructing broad alliances with the poor and politically oppressed in Haiti and Cuba. And if you look at the title of at the cover, of Waves of Decolonization, the cover is by a collaborator of Carlton Beals. Carlton Beals wrote the book The Crime of Cuba in 1933, and the crime was the fact that the U.S. government was thwarting any possibilities for democracy in Cuba and had supported a notorious dictator named Machado in Cuba. The second test case is that I focus on three novels emerging within these nationalisms that portray how U.S. neocolonialism in the Caribbean and Mexico set the conditions for struggles for rights by oppressed groups. And finally, Chapter 4, Rising Tides of Color, historicized writings by Manuel Gamio, the Mexican anthropologist and nationalist, and Zora Neale Hurston, the Harlem Renaissance novelist and folklorist, by situating them within debates on race and migration by Boasian anthropology in the Chicago School of Sociology. Boas taught both Gamio and Hurston at Columbia University, and Gamio worked closely with Chicago School sociologists and briefly taught there. In contrast to the overly optimistic view expressed by various scholars in Boasian anthropology and Chicago School sociology that interracial marriage could serve as a solution to racial conflict, Gamio and Hurston focus on how everyday experiences of gender, race, and class constituted obstacles to the full enjoyment of citizenship rights, and so take a much more pessimistic view, I would argue. Gamio's informant Isidro Osorio, for instance, says that he works so hard that he almost coughs up his lungs. And Hurston's migrant laborers are the farthest down on the race and class ladder. And this is a phrase that Robert E. Park developed with Booker T. Washington, the farthest down of society. In her novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, Janie and Tea Cake do not migrate to the city like most of the Harlem Renaissance writers, but instead travel to the Everglades in Florida, joining migrant laborers who pick beans for a living, people that Hurston says are, quote, broken from being poor, unquote.